So that's a bit of an oversimplification to just simply say, if you know all of this, then you will be fine. But this is the basics, okay, of what we're going to get into next. All right. So I know we spent a lot of time, probably more than you guys wanted, probably less than I would like, talking about skeletal muscle and control force and these kinds of things. But we'll remember in that process, when we run cross-bridge cycle, when we run the circuit enzyme, when we run the sodium, potassium pump in those things, we use energy, okay? And so, as you all will see, or you may already appreciate, as we use energy, we need a way to resynthesize or replenish this energy, okay? And I'm going to use the word resynthesize because I think that's probably the best way to conceptually approach all of this. And we're going to use multiple pathways and what we call multiple substrates. So pathways are pretty straightforward. You guys can just kind of memorize those things. Substrates are also going to be relatively straightforward. It's just a matter of keeping which substrate goes into which individual reaction. Correct. When I say substrates, I mean fat, okay, or lipids, carbohydrates, and protein. So we have these various macromolecules in which there are stored energy. Okay? They're all basically carbon-based things. We're not going to go back to more biochemistry and more organic chemistry, and I'm going to go to combustibility, right? But they swore to me it would be worth something, and I suppose in some ways it is. But we have all of this, okay? But I want to make a couple of points before we dive into all of this, because to me, I know that if you've had undergraduate with us, Dr. Mike teaches it pretty well in that way. I'm sure that at K-State, I don't know who teaches metabolism. Who gets the, does Poole teach that one, or is it?
Metabolism is usually, or you're talking about like for a basic class, like last summer course.
Yeah.
That's usually Dr. Barstow.
Okay, so you've had Barstow, so it's fine, right? I know kind of how that is. I'm not sure. I'm sure the guys at Baylor probably did perfectly well with all of this. UCO will, I don't know kind of how they present things. The most complicated thing on all of this, and there's an argument that I make, this may be the most conceptually complex thing that we cover in the entirety of class, is that all of these metabolic pathways and all of these substrates are being used simultaneously all the time. Every pathway is active, every substrate is being used all the time, okay? It is not, as it is sometimes taught to undergraduates, it is this pathway and then until it is all gone. And then we step over here and then this starts and we're going to do this one until this, and then we're going to come over here, okay? And so the complexity comes from, they're all on, we're using all of them. The complexity comes from which one is going to provide us the most energy at a particular time, like during a particular bout of exercise or at rest, and which substrate is going to be the one that we're going to use to run through a particular pathway at a particular time during a particular bout of exercise, because that's going to change, okay? What substrate is made available to the pathway matters, so I can change what I feed you and change which pathway is going to predominate. Exercise type, some, but especially exercise intensity alters which substrate and which pathway is going to be on. The amount of time that you spend at a particular intensity during a bout of exercise, the longer you go, there will begin to be potentially shifts in the substrate and the pathway that we use. And all of these things are critically important for understanding, okay, cardiovascular adaptations, pulmonary adaptations, okay, why certain people can run longer or faster than others, because some of these pathways, we make a bunch of energy and we're all good. Some of these we make less energy and there are kind of metabolic waste or metabolic byproducts that may lead to fatigue, okay? And so then there's some other things that are kind of interact with it. So that's the part that we're going to try to kind of go through and talk about the pathways first. There's this, understand those. And then really by the time we get to the second kind of set of lectures, we're going to then come back and talk about how do they fit together, right? And there are going to be key control steps that control the speed or the rate of each individual reaction with each individual substrate. And those are going to be a little bit different. And we need to understand how those control steps all fit together and kind of shift from one to the other based upon what kind of exercise are you doing, right? Are you at altitude or not? How well hydrated are you or not, okay? What's the intensity of exercise? So that stuff is going to change. And that to me is the stuff that you've got to keep in your mind, that it's all happening together, okay? Even though for some of them, as you guys will see, we can't even measure some of them, okay? I cannot very easily, and any of you right now, measure your anaerobic metabolic kind of energy contributions to things. I can infer it, I can guess at it, but I cannot really measure it. If I put you in the magnet in an MRI machine, I can measure portions of it, okay? Portions. Or I can measure the appearance of certain things and then back calculate from there kind of what's going on. But we're going to have to make some inferences, right? A couple of the pathways, we can do really good at measuring. That's not going to be a problem. But, okay, so that's sort of how we're going to start with all of this. And I think I covered, kind of a reasonable amount of all this, but it's this idea of deriving chemical energy from the breakdown of various foodstuffs, okay, or substrates, right? Whatever it is that you're eating, or if you haven't eaten, whatever it is that your body has stored, what can we break down and why? I mean, why is metabolism important? The body needs energy. Without energy, you die, okay? It's pretty simple. The significance to exercise and why we kind of focus on this a bunch in our classes is this idea that physiological responses are going to occur very often as a response to changes in metabolism. The changes that occur in the cardiovascular system during exercise occur to support changes in metabolism. Metabolism occurs to support what's happening in the muscles, but then cardiovascular changes, respiratory changes, or ventilatory changes, hormone release, a bunch of other things, they're all typically going to occur as a result. The metabolic changes are the trigger for those things, okay? Adaptations to training, especially aerobic training, are often going to be proportional to energy expended during a bout of training. The more energy you expend by running faster or longer during a bout of exercise is likely going to drive greater changes in these metabolic pathways that are going to then make it easier for you to make more energy going forward. Depending upon the type of event it is, performance is very often limited by the rate at which energy can be made available, okay? There is a reason you can only sprint so fast for so long, and it is primarily related to energy availability, okay? You can run that fast, but if I make you run more than about 18 seconds or so, some of you maybe more like 12 seconds, we had the bike, we could do a Wingate really fast. You can just watch it, okay? At some point, you cease to be able to produce sufficient amounts of energy to have all of the muscle active, generating high enough force at high enough, rates to continue going at that speed. Think about sprinting speed. It's like being on a bike, right? And you need force to run that fast, okay? You always theoretically have that ability to go at that force, but as you sprint for a little while, you're going to stop being able to produce enough energy to actually generate that much force. So simultaneously, very long distance exercises can also be limited by the rate at which energy can be made available. And it may in some instances be not that it's about a rate per se, it is about that there is just not enough energy available anymore. You guys will see there's something magic about carbohydrates that the brain likes, that allows you to continue going at these long distances. Okay? Most of you, if you were to break down whatever adipose tissue you have, even if you are a very, very lean person, you probably have a sufficient amount of stored lipid, okay, in your body to run a marathon or do something like that. But for whatever reason, that lipid is not, even though it's there, is not going to be sufficient. So we'll talk about some of that kind of stuff. Okay. Very often, fatigue or a decrease in force production can be caused with a decreased availability of energy or the accumulation of certain metabolic end products, especially hydrogen. Especially hydrogen. Okay. There are some others, but hydrogen is going to be a big one. There can be a lot of debate about the role of hydrogen, and I get kind of roll my eyes about all of this and things. And I'm just going to tell you that at least in a test tube, if I inject hydrogen, I lower the pH and things, that it messes everything up. Every part of the contractile machinery, almost every part of aerobic metabolism is inhibited by a decrease in pH. Okay, so there's some evidence and some experience. Oh, the hydrogen doesn't matter. In addition to all of that, it also hurts like shit when you have hydrogen in there. Okay, I rode my wife's bike for an hour yesterday with Ellis in the back. Let me tell you, what is nice training stimulus is to have like 30 pounds of 1.5-year-old sitting squarely over your back wheel when you're on a bike that you can't actually get a full kind of pedal stroke on because it's my wife's bike, and if I move the seat, she gets really pissed at me on those kinds of things. And so when I was done, and you're going up some hills and things, and you never realize like how constant pedaling can be. You get a lack of oxygen, you make some hydrogen, and you're like, man, my legs are burning. Anyway, not really the point. All right, so before we jump into any kind of pathway, let's talk about energy itself. Okay, so energy really is the ability to perform work. Okay, we want to define it kind of from a physical standpoint. From a bioenergetic standpoint, the flow and exchange of energy within a living system is kind of how we're going to define all of this. I want you all, you don't have to know it's the first law of thermodynamics, but I want you to appreciate kind of what this is, because I think it makes understanding how all of our pathways fit together make more sense. But the idea of the first law of thermodynamics says that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it transforms from one form to another without being depleted. Okay? This becomes, don't worry about total and kinetic and those kinds of things. You have a very, 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 very small amount of ATP in your cells right now. Very small. Okay? Like so small that you can do like a contraction with it, and that's pretty much it. Okay? So you use that ATP, and it gets converted most of the time into ADP. Sometimes then we'll do Myokinase and we go into AMP. But we've got ATP, we cleave off a phosphate, and then we take that kind of ADP scaffolding, move it over to another place, and then we hook the phosphate back on, and then it goes back, and it's just this loop, basically. Okay? You have a small amount of like cars or buses or something, which would be like an ATP molecule. Think of it like the adenosine is like the carrier in there. And all that you're doing is you're using your metabolic pathways to just keep kind of recycling what you have that's in there. We're not creating brand new stuff out of, poof, out of the air. It's the same stuff. It just gets deplete, change its form, go get reformatted back up, and just kind of this constant loop. Okay? And so that's why our pathways are so important, because you don't have very much. If we had more, it wouldn't matter nearly as much. Okay? Okay, let me kind of skip through a couple of these different things. So, when we talk about energy, the molecule that we most often refer to is ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. When you want to measure the kind of potential of things to make energy, there are about 7 to 10 kcals per mole of energy of ATP. Okay? Our rate of use is dependent upon the rate of work during exercise. So I'm going to talk about something called exercise intensity. Okay? Think of intensity as how fast you're running. Think of intensity as really how much force you're having to generate. More force, more intensity. More force, more cross-bridge cycles, more cross-producing gait. I need more ATP to be able to kind of continue with that particular rate. Okay? The rate of energy use is going to vary somewhat between fiber types because of the way the myosin ATPase works. So those fibers are a little bit more efficient. They're more like the hybrid cars, okay? That's the Prius. 2X is, you know, the freaking Hummer or whatever else we see driving around here. Cast aspersions on anybody with a, you know, four-door dually diesel with the, you know, giant thing. We'll talk about that. Okay, so I see them though. So we use pathways, different pathways and different substrates to kind of resynthesize. This ATP gets cleaved down into ADP, and then we use our metabolic pathways to reform it. It's just this constant cycle that's going on. Okay? So pathway and substrate that we use can change based upon the mode of exercise. So are you running, are you cycling, are you swimming, are you lifting weights? The intensity especially, the presence, or I should say, or lack rather than of, the presence or lack of oxygen. It is rare unless you're at like high altitudes, or it is rare, I guess, unless somebody is choking you, which, you know, whatever. That lack of oxygen is going to really play a big role. Okay, when we go to altitude, there's just less oxygen. So it really should say the concentration of oxygen in a particular place. Okay. Well, I suppose now, like, you know, we have pretty good evidence that if you get COVID and things, it affects pulmonary function. Even when it affects pulmonary function, can make the concentration of oxygen that's coming in go down. That can be a really your state of training, so people that are better trained will use slightly different pathways and substrates than people that are less well trained. And then whatever it is that you're eating, okay? Composition of your diet will play some role. The composition of a meal that you ingest immediately or kind of in the, you know, the hour or two before a particular competition is going to matter and play a role in which pathway and substrate gets used. Okay, let's talk about our substrates really quickly. I'm sure the vast majority of you guys have seen things like this before. If you've had any kind of nutrition class whatsoever, you probably talked about this until you were blue in the face. But our kind of three primary things are going to be carbohydrates, which we're going to use glucose as kind of our model molecule in the midst of all of this, but it can really be any kind of carbohydrate. You're going to have glucose that you're going to ingest. There will be glucose that will be present in your blood, and then we can store carbohydrates in both the liver and the muscle as glycogen, which is just a collection of glucose molecules that are all hooked together. We'll talk a lot more about that probably on Thursday. Okay. We can store energy, or we have energy available in the form of fat or lipids. We have stored fat. It's going to be adipose tissue. There's fat in your muscles. There's fat in and around your liver. Some of these things, or excess amounts of these things, are certainly linked to all sorts of particularly poor health outcomes. If you've eaten something that has fat in it, then you may also have kind of the breakdown kind of byproducts of kind of what is made up of in your adipose tissue. You're going to have free fatty acids, you may have glycerol, you have cholesterol molecules and things that need to be in your blood. And so we can pull these in and metabolize these, and if we don't, then they're going to get kind of stored as this. You can also do the same thing with glucose. You're either going to use it immediately, or you can store it as glycogen, or depending on what happens, you can accumulate a bunch and turn it into stored adipose tissue. We have a much larger capacity to store energy in your body as fat than we do as carbohydrates. Much larger. Okay. And then kind of probably the least appreciated of all of these, and in some ways it's the least used, but it's the one the body would prefer not to use, is going to be protein. And so protein is going to be denoted as amino acids. So you have protein in your muscles, or you can eat protein if you eat red meat or chicken or a steak or something. You're going to break them down into the amino acids. We can occasionally use them directly, but a lot of times we'll take the amino acids then we'll convert them into glucose in the liver using a process called glycolysis. Typically, we will only use protein as an energy substrate if you are in a negative energy balance. You're not eating enough. Now, that's not always true. It's become much more prevalent now that we may be in a positive energy balance, but we're just eating protein, right? All I'm doing is just giving the protein shake. I'm just going to have all the protein shake and nothing else, right? I'm not going to eat carbs. I'm just going to eat fat and protein. And so in that particular way, then I can use a bunch more protein because that's all that I'm making available to myself. Okay. All right, just some words that look alike, but all kind of mean slightly different things. We have glycolysis, we have glycogenesis, glycogenolysis, and then gluconeogenesis. So glycolysis is a metabolic pathway, which you probably have heard of. In glycolysis, we break down glucose so that we can get ATP and make lactic acid. Glycogenesis, okay, is just what it says. The genesis means kind of starting or getting together. This is synthesizing glycogen from many glucose molecules. Glycogenolysis, why it's not just called glycolysis, I don't know, but it's glycogenolysis is the kind of opposite reaction of glycogenesis. It's the breakdown of glycogen to glucose. We'll talk some about this. It's driven by a key enzyme that's called phosphorylase. And so this phosphorylase enzyme is going to play a really big role in controlling the rate at which some of the substrates that we're going to use during exercise. And there's things that happen as you change exercise intensity that will either upregulate or downregulate the function of phosphorylase. Gluconeogenesis is the synthesis of glucose from non-glucose substances or substrates, particularly amino acids. This happens in the liver. Okay, so you can eat a bunch of protein and yet you can still manage to have some or make some stored muscle glycogen because some of that protein gets converted to glucose in the liver, it gets back in the bloodstream and it goes out to your muscles. And so we can still continue to do some of this. Okay. Any questions about that, guys? You're okay?
Yeah, I mean, you're like, why is it not called glycolysis? And I was like, because it's glycolysis. It's spelled the same way.
Oh yeah, it is. Son of a bitch. Thank you, Jake. That's bugged me for like 20 years. Right. It's glycolysis is glycolysis. I'll be damned. That's really kind of killing me right now. My mind is blown now. Okay. This just kind of sums up kind of how much energy we potentially have stored in a relatively kind of a small-ish person. Would be a very small guy and a, I don't know, kind of maybe slightly larger than average depending upon height, kind of college-age female that weighs 143 pounds. 12% body fat is exceedingly low if it was a woman. So this is typically like a cross-country runner kind of guy. Here, about 1,500 kcals, and when I say kcal, that just means a calorie. What we think of as calories are really called kcals. So about 1,500 calories of stored carbohydrates in the body at any one particular time. So, you know, for an average sized person, you got enough carbs that you could not eat anything for a day and still be in a pretty reasonable kind of positive metabolic balance. Whereas conversely, if you look at subcutaneous and intramuscular fat, or even ignoring fat around the liver, in all of this, that you've got about 72,000 kcals of this. So you can imagine a person that is a little bit larger, you take an average American, right? A person who's a little larger, who has significantly more body fat, then this ratio is going to get off. So what I tell you guys with this, what I want to illustrate is just, we very often have these huge stores of lipid that we could make available during exercise. And we do a little bit, but we don't do a huge amount. Okay. So here's where things are going to get not so much tricky, but they're going to be differences in maybe how you have learned things and how I learn things, and then now how I try to teach different things from a naming perspective. Okay. And a lot of this depends upon which book you read or whose papers you follow. Again, we're scientists, we're never happier than we're arguing about dumb shit like what we call something that's the exact same thing. Okay? So what I will tell you for those of us that have Dr. Mike that take our undergraduate exercise fits is that my naming conventions are a little bit different than some of the ones that he uses. And that's partially based upon the book that he uses, and it's partially based on that it was named one thing and called one thing when he learned it quite a while before I learned it. We've kind of shifted on these things. Neither of us are wrong. We're talking about the same pathways. It's just the name is a little bit different. So I don't want you guys to freak out about all of them. Okay? So we're going to group our energy pathways into kind of three big buckets. Okay? We're going to talk about several different kinds of pathways or reactions that we're going to call the immediately available energy or the phosphagen pathways. Okay? Depending on how you use it. These are going to be reactions that are going to have a relatively small amount of ATP that we can make or that are available to be made, but they're going to occur as the name says, they can happen immediately. Right? So if I say, Alex, stand up and do 5 jumping jacks, this is the first place that we're gonna get most of the energy for doing that here. Even though these are still going, most of it initially is going to come from here. Okay? I am going to call, okay, the kind of one of the other ones that we're going to do. I'm going to call it the non-oxidative pathway. This means it's a pathway that does not use oxygen. It is longer and it takes longer than this. It's not really immediate, but it's a non-oxidative pathway. These are sometimes called the glycolytic pathways. They're also sometimes called the anaerobic pathways. Okay. In the most technical sense, those names should probably not be all used interchangeably, but that's what it's going to be. Okay. Our primary non-oxidative thing that we're going to talk about is going to be the pathway that's called glycolysis. Okay. It's called glycolysis. But just remember that we're not using oxygen, it is anaerobic. Okay? These two, the immediate phosphagen pathways and the non-oxidative pathway, occur in the cytoplasm of muscle cells. That's really important that you guys remember. Okay? They occur in the cytoplasm. The oxidative pathways, right? These are what we are commonly going to refer to as the aerobic pathways. I like to call them aerobic rather than oxidative, but this is probably from a biochemistry standpoint the more kind of absolutely correct way of doing this. Okay? This is going to be several different and kind of linked reactions that are going to be here. And it's important to remember that oxidative pathways, where we use the oxygen, even though we're going to use the oxygen at the very, very end, okay, that's going to occur in mitochondria. And so to fully run for some substrates, really for all substrates, things that are going to go through these pathways are going to start in the cytoplasm and then have to get moved into the mitochondria to be able to finish, actually make ATP. Okay? So just kind of keep that in mind, because the way that we get it into the mitochondria is going to differ based upon if it's a carbohydrate thing or if it is going to be liquid. Okay? Although I say that, and that may not actually technically be the most correct thing. I always get my fat metabolism kind of messed up. I need Dr. Deb to be here to set me straight. Dr. Deb is really the metabolic kind of guru of the department. So, okay. So, I'm going to show this now. And we're going to come back to this again once we get more towards the end. This is a graph that I like, okay, that tries to illustrate the kind of reasonable contributions of each of our kind of 3 buckets of metabolic pathways to the total energy expenditure, right, based upon, say, the time in which we're exercising. So we're going from resting to exercising out to 5 minutes. And imagine that this could be walking, okay? It could be jogging. It's probably not sprinting because you can't sprint for 5 minutes. You're getting to slow the hell down so you're not a sprint anymore. the time we get out here, but just think this is just like jogging, okay? And so here in the solid black bar, this is the immediate pathway. So this is stored ATP, this is creatine phosphate, this is the myokinase strategy. So stuff where we get energy very, very quickly. Then we have the kind of smaller dashes. This is the non-oxidative or primarily glycolytic pathways. And then here in the larger dashes, we have the oxidative or the more aerobic pathways. So while this doesn't do the best job of illustrating that they're all active all the time, you also have to imagine that here when we start, there is some metabolic need at rest, right? It is not zero. And so they're all going on here at rest, but they're at relatively low levels. So you start off, and almost immediately, you're going to get the vast majority of your energy from those immediate pathways. Those are going to, again, almost immediately drop. So by the time we get to like 30 seconds of exercise, you've blown through all of those immediate stores. Okay? Don't worry, you can make them back. It's not a big deal. They're gone. Okay? And so as that begins to fall, you will note then that both oxidative and non-oxidative are going to begin to ramp up and provide a larger contribution. Okay? We're going to get this kind of as right about the time that the immediates are going to bottom out. We're going to kind of peak off at our non-oxidative. And so that's going to happen at about 30 seconds. As we come out past maybe 2 to 3 minutes, the non-oxidatives are going to pretty much fall back down for the most part. And then by the time we get to 3 or 4 minutes, then our oxidative will kind of ramped up and take it over. We will talk a lot more about sort of why does this look, why do these curves look the way that they do? What are the enzymes that are controlling this? Why is one lagging more than the other, et cetera, et cetera? Why does this one plateau off? What does that mean? What can we learn from all of that? Okay. And then also you can run out here for 5 minutes and stop, and then they're all going to change again in a very predictable manner once we've stopped, and that's going to also tell us some things about what's happening. Okay? So people make entire careers over studying just kind of the front side slope of this change in oxidative pathways. People have made entire careers out of studying the backside once you stop the change in oxidative as it comes back down as well. Okay? So kind of these little, they seem like little things, but they're actually very, very important. Questions? Comments, concerns? No? We cover anything that could be of help for athlete tracking? Anything? Yet? No? Maybe? That's just your answer to everything. Dr. Black says the answer is muscle, right? Tell him it's muscle and metabolism. Okay. We're going to cover kind of the immediate ones first here, and then we'll probably call it a day for today because I don't want to get into philosophizing about glycolysis and why a lot of it is named incorrectly. And just forward here. But so we're going to start off with something called the creatine phosphate pathway. Okay. So remember that we have the store of ATP in our muscles. It's very, very small. Okay. So stored ATP, we don't need a pathway for. There's just ATP. If you need it, you use it. Done. Okay. It's like my daughter. There's just Cheerios lying around the house. Okay. The dogs want them. They eat them. If not, she wanders by. She grabs a Cheerio. She eats it. She thinks life is great. Okay. I then get in trouble for not picking up the Cheerios. You know, it's kind of how it works. Okay, that's ATP. Creatine phosphate, on the other hand, is a separate molecule. Okay, it is just what it says. It is a molecule, something called creatine, and then holding on to it is a phosphate molecule. And so it is synthesized from these two things. You consume creatine in your diet, and then when you have some creatine floating around, if possible, it interacts with this enzyme and you have free ATP, you're going to borrow this phosphate, stick it on there, and we'll use some other pathway to make our ATP back. Okay? So, about 98% of all the creatine in your body is located in skeletal muscle. Okay? So, the problem with creatine phosphate, It's a very fast reaction. It's a simple one-step reaction, right? Kelvin has a phosphate. I come in, chop his arm off, and then we hand it to Callie. She lost her arm. We're like, boom, done, great, onward we go, okay? Very simple, very fast. One step, okay? That's really important, one step, okay? The problem with creatine phosphate, one of the reasons that we need other pathways, we don't just use this one all the time, is that much like ATP being stored, there's a finite amount of creatine phosphate that is going to be located in your skeletal muscle, okay? So there's only so much of this. Part of the reason behind this is that there's only so much room in the skeletal muscle fiber. We can't just fill it all up with ATP or with creatine phosphate. We have to have space for other things as well. Okay? Now we do know that you can artificially load or increase the amount of creatine phosphate in your muscles by just eating a bunch of creatine. Okay? Have 3 cans of tuna fish a day. And that seems terrible, then you can just go to GNC and buy some creatine phosphate supplement. Okay? For maybe like 80% of you guys, if you're what we call a responder, if you eat a bunch or you load up with a bunch, you may be able to increase your levels by somewhere between maybe 15, 20, 25%. Okay? So you can have more. It's weird though, right? Most people probably think the creatine is for building muscle. It's not actually, it's a metabolic aid. It's a metabolic aid. We'll come back and talk about that. You can do this, okay? You can potentially do this. When we break it down, this is a kind of a two-way reaction. You have creatine phosphate floating around in your muscle cells. You have ADP that is floating around in your muscle cells because we pulled off a phosphate, right, for the cross bridges or for circa or something. And you've got some hydrogen floating around, and then we're going to drive this with an enzyme called creatine kinase, and that's going to pull the phosphate off of here and put it onto this. We make ATP, and we have free creatine. And then at some point, this free creatine is going to float back off, and if it encounters ATP again, when ATP levels go back up, your free creatine, this reaction is then going to get driven in the opposite direction, and we will resynthesize our creatine phosphate. And indeed, this is what happens. Recovery of creatine phosphate after exercise is, weirdly enough, and we'll talk about why probably next week, recovery of creatine phosphate, which we can measure in using magnetic resonance spectroscopy, is one of the single best estimates of how well your mitochondria function. It's a good marker of internal mitochondrial respiration rate. Okay? So people who have more mitochondria, or they're in better shape, their mitochondria work better, they recover their creatine phosphate faster than people that have crappy mitochondria or fewer mitochondria. So you stop exercising within, I don't know, the half-life of recovery of creatine phosphate's about somewhere between 45 and 90 seconds. What we're doing. So most people, shockingly, why do you think if you want to do these really high-intensity lifts, you're going to do like 1 rep max? Why do you think they tell you to rest about 5 minutes in between sets? Because 5 minutes at a 45, let's just call it a 60-second half-life of thing, you're at like 99% of your creatine phosphate is back, so you've got this high level of energy to be able to do things, right? So you wait 2 minutes, you're still not doing too bad, you're at 75% or something. So there's a reason that we kind of do things the way, and it's related to the kinetics of all of this. Outside of simply breaking down ATP, using the creatine phosphate breakdown is the fastest of our metabolic pathways. It's the fastest way for us to resynthesize broken down ATP. Okay? So in many ways, this tends to be to call it the first energy pathway used. I should change that word. It's not the first used, it's the first pathway to predominate. Okay? The problem is that we only have enough creatine phosphate to support high intensity, think sprinting exercise, or think I'm lifting, weights at 70 or 80% of 1 rep max for maybe 8 to about 20 seconds, depending upon how much creatine phosphate you have. Okay? Jacob, Alex, Megan, you guys seen a Wingate test done? It's called a Wingate test. Did y'all do a Wingate? I'm sure y'all do it at K-State. They don't care what y'all do. We used to not do them for our undergrads, Kelvin, Callie. Y'all did one? You probably weren't supposed to. But we would do Wingate tests when I was a grad student in Georgia, and that was like the initiation for the new lab TA. So we had like exercise phys class, and there was like a 1 hour lab with it. And if you were a TA, you taught the lab class and these things. And like every day, like every year when you did those, somebody was going to pass out. You do the thing, and then somebody passes out. It's just kind of the way it goes. Right?
UCL's exercise physiology professor is very he's very passionate about hit training and trusting for a joint every semester. I threw up.
Of course you did.
2 students, 2 other students passed out.
Yep.
For a total of 25 students, that's 2 people not using what he just loves doing that there.
So the Wingate test is a test to measure anaerobic kind of power output, right? So you get on, you guys think you get on the bike, you get like 70 or 80% of your body weight is the resistance that's placed on the bike, and you start pedaling, you get going as fast as you can, there's basically no resistance, and they drop the resistance on you, and you just got to try to kill it for 30. I mean, it's just an all-out 30-second sprint. It's awful. Well, the thing is that because of creatine phosphate, right, by about 12 or 13 seconds in most people, your power output's like, it's high, and it dips right along with it. As creatine phosphate begins to get depleted and go away, your power output dips right along with it. And like the last 15 seconds of a Wingate is like the longest 15 seconds of your life. You're just like, why did I agree to this? This fucking sucks. I'm terrible, right? And it's because we've broken all this down. So you can sprint, right? If you're a 100-meter sprinter, creatine phosphate's pretty much all that you need, right? Or at least if you're a world record 100-meter sprinter, you're kind of right there, in the kind of high to mid 9-second range there. If you're an elite 200-meter runner and you're just ducking under 20 seconds or something, they come into the 18 maybe you were the track. They're not. No, it's usually like 19 and a half or something, right? Is about the world record at 200 meters. We're really beginning to push. If you look at pace across 100 meters, once they kind of get up to pace, they can maintain that pace from 40% of the race in to the very end. Look at 200 meters, typically people will slow down a little bit in that last, say, 50 meters or so. It's like imperceptible to the naked eye, but they are slowing down, okay? Because their creatine phosphate is pretty much gone. And as it is gone, you don't have enough energy that can be supplied fast enough from your other pathways to maintain that level of force output, okay? So it's limited. It's good, but it's limited, right? So make Kelvin get up, he does some squats, he's using his creatine phosphate. At some point it's going to all go away. Okay, so there's the reaction. We talked about the resynthesis. We have some interesting ways to do all of this. Okay, so this is this idea though of PCR use and PCR recovery. These are some data that are going to come from a paper that was published a little more than 10 years ago now. Damn, I feel old. But here is the depletion of creatine phosphate. So this is a person, they're laying them in an MRI machine, and they're not actually doing an isometric contraction, but it's this. Okay? It's planar flexion, and they're focusing the magnet on their, it's probably on, that would be my medial gastroc. It's one of the gastroc muscles where it's the soleus that they're doing. And so you start off here, and what they're measuring is, this is, right, the depletion of creatine phosphate, boom, 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 down, okay? And so, or it can be seen over here, it's the same kind of thing. And then they stop exercising, and you can see this immediate resynthesis, this kind of rate that's coming up over here, or the rate that's coming up over there. I think this is exercise. They're doing the exercise without blood flow occlusion. I think this one's with blood flow occlusion. You will note that it drops a little bit farther down here. And as I said, measuring this depletion rate or this resynthesis rate can tell us a host of things, but you got to get the damn magnet to be able to do it. We don't have a magnet to do this on campus. They probably have one at the Health Science Center. But the magnets cost you $800, $1,000, $2,000 an hour to be able to rent them to do things. We had a magnet on campus when I was my last couple of years at the University of Georgia. And the guy that I worked for, who is basically Barstow's twin, like seriously, like they are like sort of, they're Macaulay, they're kind of twins in a lot of ways, not personality-wise, but in kind of the work that they do. They were working on making this work. We did a lot more structural stuff where we could just like take pictures of like muscle size and those things. They hadn't quite got the spectroscopy stuff. This is a little bit more sophisticated, but he was kind of one of the pioneers of doing some of this stuff. So it's out there, it's available. We can measure this backside thing, and we've done it in my lab a little bit. We use Ross's near-infrared spectroscopy device to do it, but you can measure the recovery of oxygen saturation on hemoglobin, and it follows very similar kinetics to this, and we think that it's kind of the same thing, that you're using the oxygen in the mitochondria to resynthesize the creatine phosphate. So if you track the oxygen, it is sort of similar to tracking the creatine phosphate. You don't have to have a magnet, you just need a $40,000 piece of equipment to put on. So, okay. Quickly, myokinase is when you have two ADP molecules and you split them, you pull a phosphate off of one, stick it onto the other, and you get an ATP and an MP. It happens, you got to be in pretty high intensity exercise for a lot of this to kind of go on. Here's just something showing, I apologize if this is not attributed, for the life of me cannot remember where this has come from. It may have come from George Brooks's Biochemistry of Exercise textbook. But it's just kind of showing a relative kind of kcals per total muscle mass of stored ATP, creatine phosphate, the equivalent if we run the myokinase, and then kind of the total that we have available, so you guys can see that. I have more kind of low amounts of stored ATP. I have necessarily 4 or 5 times as much stored also then as creatine phosphate, and then a little bit less than what I have there. I can do a little bit from the myokinase reaction. But these are kind of my immediate sources of energy. So if I need something right now, right, kind of adaptively, I got to sprint now. Tyrannosaurus is coming, run, right? Or wait, my Jurassic Park, right? If Tyrannosaurus comes, we're not supposed to run. I swear that I read a book that said that they figured out that's all like crap. They could actually see you. It wasn't just motion-based. How do we know that? I don't know from freaking fossil. Pardon?
They don't even know if they have feathers or scales out how they got that information.
I don't either. You know, we got some stuff that we can look at some genetics and things. Who knows? So that would be really freaky to see like a gigantic, like 40-foot tall fucking bird, right? A Tyrannosaurus with feathers. That would freak me out. So, okay. So we'll come back to this and we'll talk about glycolysis on. We'll pick the rest of this up on Thursday. Pearson, are you there? Have I put
I am.
Okay, sorry, we all jumped. It's very loud.
I am here.
I hadn't put you to sleep yet. That's good. Okay. Do you have any questions or anything, bud?
Not that I have.
Okay.